I asked my neighbor for dating advice, minus she whispered. Are you blind? I am in love with you. The evening she said those words, I stood completely frozen on my own porch. The warm Georgia sunset painting everything in gold behind her, and I realized that the answer to my loneliness had been standing 12 feet away from me for 3 whole years. If this story touches something in your heart, minus if you believe in second chances, unexpected love, and the kind of connection that sneaks up on you when you least expect it, minus please, like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. My name is Daniel Calloway, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of man who was good at almost everything except understanding his own heart. I was 34 years old, living in a quiet suburb of Savannah, Georgia, in a house I'd bought with the woman I thought I was going to marry. Her name was Melissa, and when she left, she didn't slam doors or throw things. She just packed a single bag on a Tuesday morning, set her key on the kitchen counter with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any argument we'd ever had, and said, Daniel, you are a good man. You are just not present. I didn't fully understand what she meant until long after her car disappeared around the corner. That was 2 years before the evening on the porch. In those 2 years, I threw myself into work, minus I was a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm downtown, minus and I kept my head down, my schedule full and my feelings carefully managed. I told myself I was healing. The truth was, I was hiding. My house stayed clean because I was never really in it, just passing through like a guest who didn't want to disturb anything. I ate at the same diner on Thursday nights, went to church on Sundays out of habit, more than faith, and spent most weekends doing small repairs around the yard, so I'd have something to show for the hours I couldn't otherwise fill. My neighbor, Claire Bennett, moved into the house next door about 8 months after Melissa left. I remember the day she arrived because I helped carry a bookshelf up her porch steps when the moving company left it at the wrong angle, and her alone with it. She had brown hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of dark amber, and she laughed at herself when she admitted she'd completely underestimated how heavy the shelf was. I liked her immediately, minus not in a romantic way. Not then, more the way you like someone who doesn't try too hard to impress you. She was a high school art teacher, 31 years old, and she'd moved to Savannah after a long-distance relationship. Had finally unraveled under the weight of 2 people pulling in different directions. We became friends naturally, the way neighbors sometimes do when neither of them is trying to be anything more than decent. She'd wave from her garden in the mornings. I'd drop off a bag of coffee beans when I went to the farmer's market and bought too many. On warm Saturday evenings, we'd sometimes end up on our respective porches at the same time and talk across the low hedge that separated our properties. Minus about nothing important, about everything. She told me about difficult students she was trying to reach. I told her about complicated job sites and the particular frustration of bureaucratic delays. We talked about books and bad television and the best barbecue in Chatham County. It was easy, comfortable, safe, I suppose, in the way that only purely platonic things feel safe. The problem began when a woman named Rachel joined my firm as a project coordinator in late January. Rachel was bright and confident and funny in a sharp, quick way that caught me off guard. She seemed interested in me, minus she laughed at things I said, found reasons to stop by my office, suggested coffee after a long team meeting. I hadn't felt that specific electricity in years, that feeling of someone choosing to look at you, and it undid something careful and locked inside me. I started to think maybe I was ready, maybe I could try again, but I had no idea how to read the situation. 2 years of self-imposed emotional exile had left me genuinely uncertain of my own instincts. So one evening in early March, when Claire and I were both outside and the air smelled like cut grass and coming spring, I did what felt natural. I asked her for advice. I told her about Rachel, about the coffee invitations, about the way my chest did something complicated every time she walked into a room. I asked Claire what she thought it meant. I asked whether she thought I should say something, ask Rachel out. Take a chance. What happened next is the part I replay in my mind more than anything else. Claire was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. She had been leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed loosely, watching me with an expression I hadn't learned to read yet. Then, she looked away toward the yard, And when she looked back, something had shifted in her face, minus something had come undone that she'd been holding very carefully in place. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Daniel," she said, "are you blind? I am in love with you." I didn't say anything. I don't think I breathed. The sunset was doing something extraordinary behind the oak trees, all deep orange and quiet gold, and Claire was standing there looking at me with an expression that was equal parts courage and terror, minus like someone who had just stepped off the edge of something very high and was still waiting to find out whether they'd fall or fly. She didn't let me stay silent for long. She exhaled and gave a soft, self-deprecating laugh that broke my heart a little. "I am sorry," she said. "That wasn't fair. Forget." I said it. And she turned to go back inside. "Claire." I said her name before I even decided to. She stopped. I had to think very carefully about what came next, because I understood in that moment that this was not a small thing. This was not a conversation I could undo or walk back from, and I didn't want to. But I also needed to be honest minus honest, in the way I had failed to be with Melissa. Honest in a way I hadn't been with myself in years. I told her I needed a day, just one day to think. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I was afraid of feeling too much too fast and getting it wrong again. She nodded, and there was something dignified in the way she accepted that, minus no pressure, no performance, just quiet understanding. She went inside, and I stood on my porch alone until the last light was completely gone. That night was the longest I can remember in a long time. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never drank, and let myself do the thing I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I actually looked at my own life. Not the surface of it, not the clean floors and the full calendar and the polished professional routine, but the actual interior of it. I thought about Melissa's words, minus not present, minus, and for the first time I understood them completely. I had been so afraid of wanting something and losing it again that I had stopped wanting anything at all. I had been calling that peace. It wasn't peace. It was just a very organized kind of emptiness. And then I thought about Claire. I thought about how she always noticed when I seemed tired before I said a word. How she'd once left a novel on my porch with a sticky note that said, "You need this one," and been exactly right. How she laughed at the parts of life I found genuinely funny, instead of the parts she thought she was supposed to. How she argued with me, sometimes about things that mattered to her without softening herself, to make it easier for me. How she was, I realized slowly and then all at once, the most honest presence in my life, and had been for over 2 years. And I had simply never let myself see it for what it was. I wasn't blind to Rachel. I was blind to Claire. And I think somewhere beneath all that careful emotional management, I had been protecting myself from her specifically, because she was real in a way that frightened me. Wanting Rachel was safe because it was new and distant and uncertain. Loving Claire minus and I understood now that it was love, slow and steady, and the kind that builds in the background, while you are looking elsewhere. Minus was terrifying, because it was already true. It had been true for a long time, and losing it would mean something. The next morning I walked across the yard before I'd even had breakfast. I knocked on her door knowing exactly what I wanted to say, not a rehearsed speech, not something I'd edited for the right impression. Just the plain truth delivered to the right person at the right time. When she opened the door, she looked like she hadn't slept well either. She was in an old college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, and she looked both braced for something difficult and too tired to perform anything but honesty. I told her that I wasn't blind, that I'd been afraid, and that fear had made me careless with things I should have paid attention to. I told her that when I sat with myself the night before and asked what I actually wanted, minus not what was comfortable, not what was safe, not what made the least amount of risk, minus the answer, was her. That it had probably been her for a while, and I'd just been too buried inside my own caution to see it clearly. I told her I didn't know exactly what we were yet, or how to do this, but I knew I didn't want to go back to standing on separate porches, pretending we were just neighbors. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider and said, "Come in, Daniel. I just made coffee." That was the beginning. Not a dramatic declaration in the rain, not a cinematic kiss at the airport, not the kind of love story that announces itself loudly. Just a man walking into his neighbor's kitchen on a Saturday morning, sitting down at her table, and finally choosing to be present. The months that followed were the realest I had lived in years. We took things slowly, not out of doubt, but out of genuine care for what we were building. We went to dinner, walked along the river on Sunday evenings, drove out to Tybee Island on a weekend in April when the light on the water was the kind of thing that makes you believe in something larger than yourself. We talked more deeply than I had talked with anyone in a very long time, about what had hurt us and what we still believed in and who we wanted to be going forward. She told me things about her long-distance relationship that had clearly cost her more than she let most people see. I told her about Melissa, about the guilt and the grief and the slow work of understanding my own patterns. We held the hard parts gently, which is something I had never quite known how to do before. There was an evening in June when we were sitting on my porch minus our porches. Both of us on mine now minus, and she was reading while I went through plans for a bridge project on my laptop. And there was no performance, no conversation being maintained for its own sake, just two people existing comfortably in the same space. I looked over at her and felt something so specific and so quiet that I didn't have a word for it at first. It wasn't excitement, though I still felt that. It was something older and more solid. It was the feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, and not needing anything about the moment to be different. I set down the laptop. She looked up from her book, and I said, without planning to, I am really glad you didn't let me walk past this. She smiled slowly, the way she did when something landed true. You would have figured it out eventually, she said. You are an engineer. You get there, you just need more data. I laughed and she laughed, and the fireflies were starting to come up from the grass, and the whole evening smelled like summer. And I thought, this is what present feels like. This is what Melissa meant. This is what I had been missing, not a person exactly, but the willingness to actually show up inside my own life and let someone else see me clearly and stay anyway. If this story moved something in you minus, if it reminded you that love doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to, that it sometimes lives 12 feet away and waits with more patience than you deserve, minus, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment below, and subscribe if you haven't already. Stories like this one exist because people like you keep showing up for them. And before this story ends, I want to ask you something personal. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments. It genuinely means something to know that a story born in a quiet